They say blood is thicker than water. But what about milk? The milk of a woman who wasn't his mother but raised him anyway. The milk that sustained him in his first years of life, drawn from breasts that had just lost their own child. What do you call that bond? What do you call that love? In November of 1859, in the darkness before a new moon, 127 enslaved people walked away from the Whitmore estate in Virginia and disappeared into the network of safe houses, false papers, and calculated courage that was the Underground Railroad. Not one was recaptured. Not one was lost. Every single person reached freedom, some in Canada, some in free northern states, all beyond the reach of the men who had claimed to own them. The story should have ended there. A perfect escape, a triumph of careful planning and communal courage. But what made the Whitmore liberation unusual, what made it controversial then and complicated now, was the man who made it possible. Thomas Whitmore Junior, the plantation owner's only son, who chose the enslaved woman who raised him over the father whose blood he carried. This is not a simple story of a white savior riding in to rescue helpless victims. The enslaved community of the Whitmore Plantation had been planning, preparing, and organizing their own liberation for years before Thomas ever questioned the world he was born into. What Thomas provided wasn't salvation, it was access. Access to papers, to money, to information, to the mechanisms of power that his privilege granted him and their bondage denied them. This is a story about two mothers, one who gave birth and died, another who gave milk and loved. It's about a boy who grew up confused by the contradiction between what he was taught and what he felt. It's about the moment when confusion became clarity, when complicity became action, and when a man had to choose between the family that owned him by blood and the family that had claimed him through care. It's also a story about the cost of that choice. Because Thomas Whitmore Jr. never went home again, never reconciled with his father, lived the rest of his life in a strange liminal space, rejected by white society for his betrayal, never quite belonging in black communities despite his devotion. He spent 30 years working to atone for the first 22 years of his complicity, and died uncertain whether atonement was even possible. Was he a hero? He would have said no. Was he a traitor? His father certainly thought so. Was he simply a man who finally, belatedly, did the bare minimum of recognizing the humanity of the woman who raised him? Perhaps that's the most honest answer. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what you think about family. The family we're born into versus the family that raises us. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge simple narratives about heroes and villains, that honor the complexity of human choice, and that remember the people history tried to forget. Margaret Whitmore died on a cold January morning in 1837, bringing her son into the world as she left it. The midwife did everything she could, but sometimes the body simply gives up, surrendering one life to create another. Thomas Whitmore Sr. held his wife's hand as she faded, felt the moment her grip loosened, and looked at the tiny, screaming infant with something closer to horror than love. The baby would need a wet nurse. Immediately, infant formula didn't exist. Without a woman's milk, the child would die within days. And Thomas Sr., grief-stricken and barely functional, certainly couldn't provide what his son needed. There was a woman in the quarters who had given birth just 3 days before Margaret. The plantation overseer knew this because he kept meticulous records of births. Property increased, after all, when enslaved women produced children. He mentioned it to Thomas Sr., who nodded numbly and gave the necessary order. Bring her to the house. The baby needs a nurse. That woman was Clara. Clara was 28 years old in 1837, and 3 days earlier, she had given birth to a daughter who never drew breath. Stillborn, the midwife said. These things happen, as if the death of a child could be reduced to mere statistics and probability. Clara's body still produced milk meant for a baby who would never drink it. Her breasts ached with abundance her daughter would never need. Her arms felt empty in a way that made breathing difficult. When the overseer came to her cabin and told her she was to nurse the master's son, Clara understood immediately what it meant. Her grief was now conscripted. Her body, which had already been owned in labor, was now owned in its most intimate maternal function. She would feed another woman's child while her own lay in an unmarked grave behind the quarters. She wanted to refuse, wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but what they were demanding. But Clara had lived her entire life enslaved. She knew that wanting and doing were separated by an uncrossable gulf of power. So she dried her tears, wrapped herself in a thin shawl, and walked to the main house where a motherless infant was crying for milk her body could provide. The first time she held Thomas Whitmore Junior, she felt nothing but resentment. This white child, wrapped in soft blankets, would live in luxury built on her labor. He would grow up to own people like her, to think of human beings as property, to perpetuate the system that had killed her daughter through the simple stress of enslaved pregnancy. But then he latched onto her breast and began to nurse, and something in Clara's body betrayed her mind. The relief of milk flowing was physical, undeniable. The baby's small hand rested against her skin. His eyes, unfocused and new to the world, gazed up at her. And despite everything, despite the rage and grief and injustice of it all, she felt a connection forming. She hated herself for it, but she felt it anyway. For the first 2 years of his life, Thomas Jr. was Clara's constant companion. She nursed him every few hours. She rocked him to sleep. She sang to him, spirituals and work songs and lullabies her own mother had sung to her. She changed him, bathed him, soothed him when he cried, celebrated his first words and first steps. Thomas Sr., meanwhile, remained emotionally absent. He couldn't look at his son without seeing Margaret, couldn't hold the boy without feeling the weight of what that birth had cost. He provided for his son materially, fine clothes, a beautiful nursery, every physical comfort, but he provided nothing emotionally. He was a ghost in his own home, haunting the corridors of the mansion while Clara raised his child. By the time Thomas Jr. was 2 years old, he had formed a complete and total bond with Clara. She was his world, his security, his source of comfort. When he fell and hurt himself, he ran to Clara. When he woke from nightmares, he called for Clara. His first clear sentence was, "Mama Clara loves me." That was when Thomas Sr. first felt alarm. The boy was becoming too attached to a slave. It was one thing for an infant to be nursed and cared for by enslaved women. That was common practice across the South. But at 2 years old, the child should be transitioning to recognize proper social hierarchies. He should understand that Clara was property, not family, that she served him, not loved him. But every time Thomas Sr. tried to assert himself in his son's life, the boy cried for Clara. And Clara, despite knowing the danger, couldn't help but respond to those cries. The child she was raising had become, in her heart, if not in law, hers. The years passed. Thomas Jr. grew from toddler to young boy. Clara continued to be his primary caregiver, though the intimacy of nursing had ended. She taught him his letters, having learned to read in secret herself. She told him stories. She comforted his fears and celebrated his joys. She loved him, completely and complicatedly, even as she understood the profound injustice of the situation. Thomas Sr. watched this bond with increasing discomfort. His son was 7 years old and more attached to an enslaved woman than to his own father. The boy spoke with hints of Clara's accent, hummed her songs, quoted her wisdom. When guests visited and asked about the child's upbringing, Thomas Sr. had to admit, shamefully to his mind, that a slave had essentially raised his heir. On Thomas Jr.'s 8th birthday, his father made a decision that would shape the rest of the boy's life. The attachment had to end. Clara had to be removed from the house and sent to the fields. The boy needed to be raised by proper tutors, by white men who would teach him his place in the social order, who would train him to become the kind of man who could run a plantation and own enslaved people without the complication of seeing them as human. The day they took Clara away, 8-year-old Thomas Jr. screamed until his voice gave out. He clung to her skirts, begged his father not to send her away, promised to be good if only she could stay. Clara held him as long as she was allowed, whispered that she loved him, that she would always love him, that nothing could change that. "But Mama Clara," he sobbed, "why can't you stay?" She looked at Thomas Sr., who stood watching with an expression of grim determination. Then she looked back at the child she had raised from birth, the boy she loved as much as she had loved her own lost daughter. "Because your father says I can't, baby, and he has the power to say so. But that's not fair." "No," Clara agreed, her own tears falling now. "It's not fair. Remember that, Thomas. Remember that this isn't fair." They pulled her away from him then, and she walked toward the fields, toward a life of brutal labor under the Virginia sun, her heart breaking with every step. Behind her, Thomas Jr.'s screams faded into hopeless sobs. That night, Thomas Sr. sat his son down for a conversation meant to establish proper boundaries. "Clara is a slave. She belongs to us. like the horses in the stable or the furniture in this house. You've been allowed to develop an inappropriate attachment because I was weak in my grief. But you're 8 years old now, old enough to understand the truth. She is not your mother. She is not your family. She is property, and you are the owner's son. That's the natural order of things ordained by God and society. Do you understand? Thomas Junior, red-eyed and exhausted from crying, looked at his father and said something that would haunt Thomas Sr. for the rest of his life. If that's the natural order, then nature is wrong. Over the next 14 years, Thomas Jr. would learn to navigate two worlds. In the presence of his father and tutors, he learned to speak the language of ownership and hierarchy. He studied plantation management, learned to calculate profit margins based on enslaved labor, was taught that some people were meant to rule and others to serve. But at night, when he could slip away, he would visit the quarters and find Clara. She was older now, her hands rough from fieldwork, her back bent from years of brutal labor. But when she saw him, her face would light up, and she would call him baby boy, as she had when he was small. "Mama Clara," he would say, sitting beside her on the porch of her cabin, "I don't understand. Father says you're not really my mother, but you raised me. You loved me. Doesn't that make you my mother?" "By any definition, that matters, yes," Clara would say carefully. "But the law doesn't care about what matters. The law says I'm property and you're my owner. The law is wrong, Thomas. But it's still the law. When I'm grown," Thomas promised on more than one occasion, "I'll free you. I'll make it right." Clara would smile sadly at these promises, knowing that children's idealism rarely survived into adulthood. "Maybe you will, baby. I hope you do. But hoping is dangerous for people like me. Hope can break your heart worse than anything else." As Thomas grew into adolescence and then young adulthood, the contradiction between what he had been taught and what he felt became harder to ignore. He saw his father's well-run plantation with increasingly uncomfortable clarity. The whippings he was supposed to accept as necessary discipline looked like torture. The family separations he was taught were good business, looked like atrocities. The contented, enslaved people he was told about looked exhausted, afraid, broken. But he did nothing. He was the owner's son, inheritor of all this, complicit in every moment of his privileged existence. He told himself he would change things when he had power, when his father died and the plantation became his. He told himself he was different from other slaveholders because he felt bad about it. He was 22 years old before he understood that feeling bad while doing nothing was just another form of participation. The awakening came on a spring morning in 1859. It came in the form of violence against the woman who had raised him. Thomas Whitmore Junior was reviewing plantation accounts in his father's study when he heard shouting from the direction of the fields. This wasn't unusual. Overseers frequently raised their voices to assert dominance. But something about the tone made him set down his pen and walk to the window. What he saw made his blood freeze. Clara stood in the cotton field, her head bowed, while the overseer, a brutal man named Hutchins, raised his whip for another strike. Even from this distance, Thomas could see the blood soaking through the back of her dress from previous lashes. He was running before he made a conscious decision to do so. By the time he reached the field, Hutchins had struck 3 more times. Clara had fallen to her knees, but hadn't cried out. She had learned decades ago that screaming only encouraged more violence. Other enslaved workers stood frozen, forced to witness as a warning to them all. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, grabbing Hutchins' arm mid-swing. "What are you doing?" Hutchins, annoyed at the interruption, jerked his arm free. "Discipline, Mr. Whitmore. Your father's orders. Any slave who can't meet quota gets the lash. This one's been slow all week." Thomas looked at Clara, really looked at her for the first time in months. She was 50 years old now, her body worn down by 22 years of field labor that had begun the day she was sent away from the house. Her hands shook with exhaustion. Her face was gaunt from inadequate nutrition. "She's old," Thomas said, his voice strange in his own ears. "She can't work as fast as she used to. That's not defiance, that's not your concern, sir," Hutchins interrupted. "Your father put me in charge of discipline. If you have a problem with my methods, take it up with him." Clara finally looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes. Her expression was complex. Gratitude that he'd tried to intervene, resignation that it wouldn't matter, and something else. A question, maybe, or a challenge. "What are you going to do about it?" Thomas helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed. I'll take her to the house. She needs medical attention. Your father won't like you interfering, Hutchins warned. Then my father can speak to me about it. He did that evening, in a conversation that would change everything. Thomas Sr. found his son in the library, and his face was dark with anger. Hutchins tells me you countermanded his discipline today. You undermined his authority in front of the slaves. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is? She's 50 years old, Thomas said, his own anger rising. You've worked her in the fields for 22 years. She's exhausted, probably malnourished, and you're having her whipped for not meeting impossible quotas. How is that acceptable? She's property. If she can't maintain her value, she receives correction. That's how this works. That's how what works? Slavery? Yes, I know. I've been taught my whole life how to manage human beings like they're livestock. But she's not livestock, Father. She's Clara. She raised me. She loved me when you couldn't even look at me. Thomas Sr.'s face went white. How dare you? You dare? Thomas shot back. You dare whip a woman who gave me her milk when Mother died? Who raised me for 8 years while you were too consumed with grief to be a father? You dare treat her like an animal when she's more of a parent to me than you've ever been? The silence that followed was terrible. Finally, Thomas Sr. spoke, his voice cold. She gave you milk because I ordered her to. She raised you because I allowed it. Any care she showed was compelled, not chosen. She's a slave, Thomas. She does what she's told. Don't confuse obedience with love. I don't, Thomas said quietly. I confuse cruelty with necessity. But I'm done being confused. He left his father's study and went directly to Clara's cabin, where she lay on a hard wooden pallet, her back bandaged with rags. Mama Clara, he said, kneeling beside her. I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was this bad. I should have done something. She cut him off with a bitter laugh that turned into a wince of pain. You didn't know? Baby boy, you've lived on this plantation your whole life. You've walked past these cabins, seen us working, watched us every day. What do you mean you didn't know? Father always said. He told me you were treated well, that this was the best system for everyone, that good masters existed. Clara's voice was sharp despite her weakness. Good masters, like good chains. Still chains, Thomas. Your father beats people with a whip. Some masters beat people with kind words and inadequate food and the constant threat of families being torn apart. It's all violence. You just couldn't see it because you benefited from it. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Tell me, he said. Tell me everything. I need to understand. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Tell me, he said. Tell me everything. I need to understand. So Clara told him about the forced breeding programs his father ran, pairing enslaved people like livestock to produce children who would become more property. About the family separations, including her own. She had 2 other children who had been sold away before Thomas was born. Children she would never see again. About the starvation rations that kept everyone perpetually weak. About the discipline shed behind the barn where resistant people were broken through isolation and torture. About the deaths that were covered up, reported as accidents or natural causes when they were anything but. She told him about the night she'd given birth to her stillborn daughter. How the midwife said it was likely caused by the stress and malnutrition of enslaved pregnancy. How she had barely been allowed to grieve before being commanded to the main house to nurse a white baby. I hated you at first, she said, her voice raw with honesty. Hated what you represented. But you were just a baby, innocent of everything except the circumstances of your birth. And when you looked at me with those big eyes and called me Mama, I loved you. I couldn't help it. Even though loving you meant betraying my own grief, meant giving you the milk meant for my daughter, meant caring for the child of the man who owned me, I loved you anyway. I loved you too, Thomas whispered. I love you still. Mama Clara, I swear to you, I'll make this right. You'll what? Clara interrupted. Free me? Free everyone? Your father would never allow it. And even if you could, what about all the other plantations? All the other masters? One good deed doesn't undo the system, Thomas. Maybe not, Thomas agreed. But one good deed is better than continued complicity. Tell me what I can do, please. I have access to things you don't. Papers, money, information. I can help. I want to help. Clara studied his face for a long moment, seeing the boy she had raised, but also seeing something new. Conviction, maybe, or the beginning of it. Finally, she said, "There are people in the quarters who've been planning, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity. If you really want to help, I'll introduce you. But Thomas, understand this. They won't trust you easily. You're the master's son. You're part of the problem. If you want to be part of the solution, you'll have to earn it." "I'll earn it," Thomas promised, "whatever it takes." That night, in a small cabin lit by a single candle, Thomas Whitmore Junior met with the people who would change his life and the lives of 127 others forever. The cabin belonged to Moses, a 45-year-old man who had been the unofficial leader of the enslaved community for over a decade. He was intelligent, careful, and deeply skeptical of the young white man Clara had brought to his door. "Forgive me for being blunt," Moses said after Clara made introductions. "But why should we trust you? You've lived here 22 years benefiting from our slavery. Now suddenly you want to help? What changed?" Thomas could have made excuses, could have tried to explain that he'd always been uncomfortable with slavery but hadn't known what to do. But Clara's earlier words about complicity rang in his ears, and he chose honesty instead. "Nothing changed, except that I finally stopped lying to myself," he admitted. "I've been complicit my entire life. Every meal I ate, every comfortable bed I slept in, every moment of education and leisure, all of it was built on your stolen labor. I knew it was wrong somewhere deep down, but I chose comfort over conscience. I chose to believe my father's lies about good masters and natural order, because questioning those lies would have meant giving up everything." He paused, meeting Moses' eyes. "You shouldn't trust me based on my character. My character has been weak for 22 years, but you might be able to use me anyway. I have access to things you need: papers, money, information about patrol routes and schedules. I can forge documents. I can manipulate systems from the inside. I'm not asking you to trust me as a person. I'm offering myself as a tool." The distinction seemed to land. Moses exchanged glances with the others in the room. Ruth, a 55-year-old woman who worked in the main house, Isaiah, 32, one of the strongest field workers, and 3 others whose faces Thomas recognized but whose names he didn't know. "A tool," Moses repeated thoughtfully. "That's more honest than most white people would be. All right, tell us what you know about the Underground Railroad." Thomas did. He had heard his father and other plantation owners discuss it with fear and fury. The network of safe houses and conductors that helped enslaved people escape to free states in Canada. He knew that abolitionists in Richmond, just 40 miles away, were active in the network. He knew the patrol schedules and the roads that were watched most carefully. "I have contacts in Richmond," Thomas said. "Business associates of my father who I've met at social events. Some of them are Northern sympathizers, abolitionists even. If I could get a message to them discreetly—" "You could," Isaiah interrupted. "But would they trust you? You're a plantation owner's son. How do they know you're not setting a trap?" "They don't," Thomas admitted. "But I could prove myself. I could bring information, documents that show I'm serious. You could get us all killed," Ruth said flatly. "If your father suspects anything, if anyone discovers what you're doing, we don't just die. We die badly. You understand that? Slow deaths meant to serve as examples." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "I understand." "Do you?" Clara asked gently. "Thomas, baby, this isn't a novel or a romantic adventure. This is life and death. And even if everything goes perfectly, even if every single person makes it to freedom, you lose everything. Your father, your inheritance, and your entire life as you know it. You become a traitor to your class, your race, your family. Are you ready for that?" He thought about his comfortable room in the main house, about the education his father had paid for, about the wealth he stood to inherit. He thought about his father, complicated and grief-stricken and cruel, who despite everything was still his blood. Then he thought about Clara, who had given him milk and love and raised him to be human. He thought about her daughter, dead because slavery's stress had killed her before she could be born. He thought about all the unnamed children who had died in the fields, all the families torn apart, all the people treated as property, while men like his father slept soundly in comfortable beds. "I'm ready," he said. "Tell me what you need me to do." Over the next 6 months, Thomas Whitmore Jr. lived a double life. By day, he was the dutiful son learning to manage the plantation. His father, pleased that the earlier confrontation seemed to have been a temporary aberration, began teaching Thomas the business in earnest. How to calculate the value of enslaved people, how to maximize profit, how to maintain discipline. Thomas learned it all, hating every moment, but knowing that the information was useful. He learned the patrol schedules and the routes they watched. He learned which neighboring plantations were most vigilant and which were careless. He learned his father's handwriting well enough to forge it. He learned where the money was kept and how to manipulate the account books to hide small but accumulating thefts. By night, he was part of the conspiracy. He met with Moses and the others, sharing information, making plans, slowly earning their trust through actions rather than words. He made contact with Frederick, a free black man in Richmond who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The first meeting was tense. Frederick was deeply suspicious of a wealthy white plantation owner's son claiming to want to help, but Thomas brought proof, detailed maps of the area, information about patrol patterns, and a bag of gold coins embezzled from his father's accounts. "If this is a trap," Frederick said, weighing the gold in his hand, "it's an expensive one." "It's not a trap," Thomas replied. "It's atonement, which I know isn't enough, but it's what I can offer." Frederick studied him for a long moment. "Atonement? You're feeling guilty?" "Yes." "Good. You should. But guilt is useless unless it leads to action. So what's your plan?" The plan took shape over months of careful preparation. 127 people would escape on a single night, a massive coordinated operation far beyond the typical Underground Railroad evacuation of 1 or 2 people at a time. It was audacious to the point of insanity, but Moses argued it was necessary. "If we go 1 or 2 at a time, your father will notice. He'll increase security. He'll make it harder for others to leave. But if we all go at once, if we empty this plantation in a single night, he can't stop it. He can only react. By then, we'll be gone." The date was set for November 15th, 1859, the night of the new moon when darkness would be deepest. Thomas would use his father's business trip to Charleston as cover. The old man would be gone for 3 days, giving them a window of opportunity. In preparation, Thomas forged 127 freedom papers over 3 months, each one a perfect copy of his father's signature and seal. He embezzled $5,000 in small amounts that wouldn't be immediately noticed, converting it to gold coins that could be divided among the escaping families. He mapped out 7 different routes north, coordinating with Frederick to ensure safe houses were prepared at every stop. The enslaved community did their own preparation. They taught each other to read their freedom papers, to recognize important landmarks, to know what to say if stopped by authorities. They gathered what few possessions mattered most. A few couldn't bear to leave behind small treasures. Photos of sold-away family members, tokens of lives lived in bondage. They said goodbye to the dead, buried in the unmarked cemetery behind the quarters, promising the ancestors that they would be remembered in freedom. There were close calls. Hutchins, the overseer, noticed Thomas spending too much time in the quarters and reported it to Thomas Sr. The old man confronted his son. "What business do you have down there?" "Learning the property," Thomas replied, using the language of ownership that made him sick. "You said I needed to understand plantation management. How can I manage people I don't know?" His father accepted this, perhaps even approved of it. "Just remember what they are," he warned. "Be familiar with the stock, but don't forget you're the owner." Another close call came when Thomas was caught in his father's study at 2 a.m, forging freedom papers. His father, unable to sleep, had come looking for a book and found his son at the desk with papers spread everywhere. "Working late?" Thomas Sr. asked, suspicious. "Trying to understand the account books." Thomas lied, casually placing his hand over the papers he'd been forging. "I can't sleep thinking about profit margins. You've said I need to understand the business better." His father, exhausted and slightly drunk, accepted this and went back to bed. Thomas sat in the darkened study for an hour afterward, his heart racing, knowing how close he'd come to discovery and death. The hardest part was the toll it took on Clara. She was working longer hours than ever, taking on extra work to avoid suspicion, deliberately acting more subservient to contrast with Thomas's increasing presence in the quarters. She bore extra punishments without complaint, knowing that any hint of unusual behavior could trigger investigation. One night, Thomas found her after a particularly brutal day, her hands bleeding from cotton picking. "This is my fault," he said, trying to help her bandage the wounds. If you hadn't started this, Clara interrupted, "I would still be enslaved with no hope of freedom." These hands have bled for 22 years, Thomas. They can bleed a few more months if it means I die free instead of in chains. You won't die, Thomas promised. None of you will. I'll make sure everyone gets north safely. Clara smiled sadly. Baby boy, you can't promise that. Too many things can go wrong. But I appreciate the sentiment. As November approached, the tension became almost unbearable. Everyone involved knew they were walking a razor's edge. One wrong word, one suspicious glance, one overlooked detail could mean not just failure, but death. Thomas lost weight, barely able to eat from stress. Moses developed a nervous habit of checking and rechecking plans. Even the children in the quarters were quieter than usual, picking up on the adults' anxiety without understanding its source. On November 10th, Thomas's father left for Charleston, expecting to be gone 5 days on business. That gave them their window. The date was confirmed, passed through the quarters in coded spirituals and subtle hand signals. November 15th at nightfall. 127 people would walk away from the Whitmore Plantation and toward freedom. The night before, Thomas sat with Clara on the porch of her cabin, both of them too nervous to sleep. Are you scared? He asked. Terrified, she admitted, but also hopeful. For the first time in my life, Thomas, I'm hopeful. It's almost scarier than the fear. Why? Because hope can be taken away. Fear is steady, reliable. But hope makes you vulnerable. Thomas took her hand, careful of the bandages on her fingers. Tomorrow night, Mama Clara, you'll be free. Really, truly free. No master, no chains, no one who can ever hurt you again. And what about you? She asked. You won't be able to come home. Your father will know you helped us. You'll be wanted for theft, for helping slaves escape. You lose everything. I gain everything, Thomas corrected. I gain the ability to look at myself in a mirror. I gain you as family by choice instead of by forced circumstance. I gain 127 people who will remember that a Whitmore finally did something right. Clara squeezed his hand. Your mother, your birth mother, would be proud of you. I never met Margaret, but I know she was kind. She would be proud. I hope so, Thomas said. But the mother I remember, the one whose opinion actually matters to me. Are you proud? Clara's eyes filled with tears. So proud, baby boy. So very proud. They sat together in the darkness. A woman who had been enslaved for 50 years and a man who had been complicit for 22. Both of them knowing that tomorrow night would change everything and could never be undone. 127 people were counting on them. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, they were going to set them all free. Act 4. The Liberation. November 15th, 1859 dawned cold and clear. The kind of autumn day where breath becomes visible in morning air, and frost clings to grass until noon. Thomas woke early, though he hadn't really slept. His room in the main house, the room he'd occupied his entire life, suddenly felt like a museum of someone else's life. After tonight, he would never sleep here again, never see his father again, probably. Never be Thomas Whitmore Junior, heir to the plantation, respectable member of Virginia society. Good riddance. He spent the day going through the motions of normalcy, while his mind raced through the plan for the 100th time. At breakfast, he ate alone in the empty dining room, served by Sarah, one of the house slaves who would be leaving tonight. She was 60 years old and could barely imagine what freedom would feel like, but she was determined to reach it or die trying. Mr. Thomas, she said quietly as she poured his coffee. Tonight is tonight? Tonight is tonight, he confirmed. She nodded, a slight smile crossing her weathered face, then louder, in her servant voice, for any potential listeners. Will you be needing anything else, sir? No, Sarah. Thank you. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas reviewed the account books, calculating profit margins for a plantation he hoped would soon have no workers. He checked the patrol schedules, noting with satisfaction that Hutchins would be off the property visiting his own family that evening. One less obstacle. He went through his father's papers, taking nothing but memorizing locations of important documents that might prove useful later. At 4 o'clock, he wrote a letter to his father. He had been drafting it in his mind for weeks, and now he put it to paper. Father, by the time you read this, I will be gone. And so will every enslaved person on this plantation. I have helped them escape. I have forged freedom papers in your name, embezzled money from your accounts, and used every privilege my birth granted me to dismantle what you built. You will call this betrayal. I call it choosing the mother who raised me over the father whose blood I carry. Clara gave me milk when Mother died. She gave me love when you couldn't. She taught me kindness and humanity while you taught me to see people as property. I know you believe slavery is natural, ordained, necessary. But it is none of those things. It is a choice we make every day. To treat some humans as less than human. To profit from suffering. To build comfort on the backs of the brutalized. I chose differently tonight. Not because I'm heroic, but because Clara deserved better than what you gave her. They all did. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't want reconciliation. I want you to know that your son, the boy you couldn't love because looking at him reminded you of loss, chose love over inheritance, conscience over comfort, and freedom over the evil comfort of complicity. Clara was more of a parent to me than you ever were, and tonight I'm finally acting like her son. Goodbye, Father. Thomas, he sealed the letter and left it on his father's desk, where it would be found in the morning. Then he gathered the few things he planned to take: a photograph of his mother, a small bag of clothes, the remaining embezzled money, and the forged freedom papers. Everything else, the fine furniture, the books, the symbols of his privileged life, he would leave behind without regret. As the sun set at 5:47 p.m., Thomas walked down to the quarters for the last time. 127 people were gathered in small groups, their faces showing a mixture of terror, excitement, and disbelief that this was actually happening. Children clung to their parents. Elderly people who had spent 50, 60, even 70 years enslaved tried to comprehend that they might die free. Moses stood at the center, Clara beside him. When Thomas approached, Moses raised his hand for silence. "Tonight," Moses said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "we walk away from this place. Some of us were born here. Some of us have buried children in that cemetery. All of us have bled for this land and the man who claimed to own it. But tonight, we take back what was always ours, ourselves." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Thomas Whitmore," Moses continued, and Thomas felt every eye turn to him, "is the reason we have the means to do this. Papers, money, information. Without him, we would still be planning and waiting. With him, we act tonight." There was scattered applause, but also skepticism in some faces. Thomas understood. He was still the master's son, still the one who had benefited from their suffering. One good act didn't erase 22 years of complicity. Clara stepped forward. "I raised this boy from birth, fed him my milk, taught him to walk, loved him when his own father couldn't. And yes, I resented it at first. Resented giving a white child the love I couldn't give my own dead daughter. But Thomas, my Thomas, grew up to be worth that love. Tonight he proves it." She turned to Thomas, taking his hands in hers. "Thank you, baby boy, for choosing right, for choosing us, for choosing me." Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. "You chose me first, Mama Clara. You chose to love me when you had every reason not to. This is just me finally understanding what you've always known. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who cares, who stays." Moses distributed the freedom papers and divided the gold. The crowd separated into 7 groups, each taking a different route to reduce suspicion. They would converge at various safe houses in Richmond, then be conducted north through the Underground Railroad network. Thomas would lead the first group, 20 people including Clara. Moses would lead the second, Ruth the third. The remaining groups had leaders chosen from the strongest and smartest among them. Each leader had a map, a coded list of safe houses, and enough money to bribe officials if necessary. At 8 p.m., as full darkness fell, the first group slipped away from the plantation. They moved quietly through the woods, avoiding roads where patrols might spot them. Thomas led them with a confidence he didn't quite feel, using maps he'd memorized and routes Frederick had provided. Behind them, at 10-minute intervals, the other groups departed. By 9 p.m., the Whitmore Plantation quarters stood empty for the first time in its 80-year history. They walked through the night, covering 12 miles before the first rest. Clara, at 50 years old and exhausted from decades of fieldwork, struggled to maintain the pace. Thomas stayed beside her, supporting her when she stumbled. "I'm slowing everyone down," she gasped during a brief stop. "You're doing fine," Thomas assured her. "We're not racing. We're just moving forward." "I've never been this far from the plantation," Clara admitted. "I was born there. I thought I'd die there. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Around them, the others in their group were experiencing similar revelations. Children who had never known anything but enslavement were seeing forests and streams they'd never been allowed to explore. Adults were taking their first steps on ground they actually chose to walk on, not ground they were forced to work. By dawn, they reached the first safe house, a farm owned by a Quaker family named the Thompsons, who had been sheltering runaways for 15 years. Mrs. Thompson took one look at the exhausted group and immediately began preparing food and setting up places to rest. "You're safe here," she told them. "Rest, eat, and tomorrow night you'll continue north." Thomas couldn't rest. He kept watch, expecting pursuit, expecting his father to somehow appear with dogs and guns. But the hours passed quietly. By evening, word came from Frederick that all 7 groups had reached their first safe houses. 127 people, all accounted for, all safe so far. The journey north took 9 days. They traveled by night, rested by day in safe houses arranged by the Underground Railroad network. They crossed from Virginia into Maryland, then Maryland into Pennsylvania, gradually moving into free territory. But free territory didn't mean safe. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even in free states, black people could be captured and returned to slavery. They needed to reach Canada for true safety. On the 5th day, as Thomas's group was crossing through Maryland, they encountered a patrol. Thomas's heart stopped as the 2 armed men approached their wagon, suspicious of the large group traveling together. "Where are you all heading?" the lead patrolman asked. Thomas handed over the forged freedom papers, his voice steady despite his terror. "These are freed people, sir. Legally emancipated by their former master, Thomas Whitmore Senior of Virginia. I'm escorting them to their new employment in Pennsylvania." The patrolman examined the papers, which looked absolutely authentic because they were written on genuine Whitmore letterhead with Thomas's father's forged signature. "This many freed at once? Unusual." "Mr. Whitmore is ill," Thomas lied smoothly. "He's settling his affairs and decided to manumit his slaves rather than burden his heir with their care. Generous, but impractical in my opinion." The patrolman looked at the group. Men, women, children, elderly, all of them exhausted and frightened, but trying to appear calm. Finally, he handed back the papers. "All right, move along." They drove away slowly, nobody breathing fully until they were a mile down the road. Then Clara grabbed Thomas's hand and squeezed it so hard her nails drew blood. "I thought we were caught," she whispered. "I thought it was over." "Not over," Thomas said. "Not until you're in Canada." The close call galvanized them to move faster. They pushed through the remaining miles with desperate urgency. On November 24th, 9 days after leaving the Whitmore Plantation, Thomas's group crossed from New York into Canada. The moment they crossed the border, everything changed. Clara stopped walking, looked around at the Canadian landscape, and began to weep. Others joined her, crying, laughing, embracing each other in joy and disbelief. "We're free," someone said. "We're actually free." Thomas stood apart, letting them have this moment. This wasn't his triumph. This was theirs, the result of their courage, their planning, their willingness to risk everything for freedom. He had merely been a tool they used, and that was exactly as it should be. Clara eventually came to him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for—" "Don't thank me," Thomas interrupted gently. "You gave me everything first. This is just me finally understanding what I owed you." Over the next week, word came that all 7 groups had made it safely across the border. 127 people, all free. Not one captured, not one lost. The impossible had become real. Act 4. The Reckoning. Back in Virginia, Thomas Whitmore Senior returned from Charleston on November 17th to find his plantation in chaos. The quarters were empty. His workers, his property, were gone. And on his desk was a letter from his son, explaining exactly what had happened and why. The old man read the letter 3 times, each reading making the reality sink in deeper. His son had betrayed him. His empire was destroyed. 127 enslaved people represented over $100,000 in property value. Wealth that had simply walked away in the night. He tried to organize pursuit, but the fugitives had a 2-day head start and 7 different routes. By the time he got authorities mobilized, they were already across state lines. By the time he offered rewards for their capture, they were in free territory. By the time he accepted, they were truly gone, They were in Canada, beyond his reach forever. The other plantation owners in the area were horrified and fascinated in equal measure. How had 127 people escaped simultaneously without anyone noticing? The answer: that the master's own son had orchestrated it, sent shockwaves through Virginia society. Thomas Junior became infamous, wanted for theft, for forging documents, for violating the Fugitive Slave Act. A reward of $5,000 was posted for information leading to his capture. His name became synonymous with betrayal, used by Southern parents to warn their children about the dangers of excessive sympathy toward enslaved people. But Thomas never returned to Virginia, and the reward was never claimed. He settled in Toronto, in the same community where Clara and many of the freed Whitmore slaves built their new lives. He worked as a teacher, using his education to help others. He lived simply, in a small apartment, his days of wealth and privilege permanently behind him. The relationship with his father was permanently severed. Thomas Sr. sent one letter to Canada, forwarded through intermediaries. "Thomas, I don't understand what you've done. I don't understand why you chose them over your own blood, over your inheritance, over everything I built for you. But you are my son. Despite everything, you are my son. If you return, if you recant, I will forgive you. We can rebuild together. Please come home." Father Thomas wrote back once, "Father, I am home. For the first time in my life, I'm home. Clara is here. The people you called property are here, building lives as free human beings. This is where I belong. I'm sorry that you can't understand, but I'm not sorry for what I did. Goodbye." There would be no more letters. Thomas Sr. lived another 3 years. The plantation, without workers, collapsed. He couldn't afford to hire free labor, and no enslaved people would work for him after word spread about what had happened. He sold the land for a fraction of its value and died in 1862, alone and bitter, convinced until his last breath that his son had committed an unforgivable sin. In Toronto, life was complicated for Thomas. He was welcomed by the community he had helped free, but he never quite belonged. He was white in a predominantly black community. He was the former master's son among people who had been enslaved. He had done one good thing, but he had also benefited from slavery for 22 years before acting. Some in the community saw him as a hero. Others saw him as someone finally doing the bare minimum after years of complicity. A few saw him with suspicion, wondering if his betrayal of his father meant he could betray anyone. Thomas understood all these perspectives and agreed with most of them. He wasn't a hero. He was just someone who had finally stopped being complicit in evil. That didn't make him good, it just made him less bad. He never married, never had children. He poured his energy into teaching and helping new refugees from slavery adapt to freedom. He published a memoir in 1871 titled Two Mothers, A Meditation on Blood and Love, which sold modestly but sparked intense debate. Critics called him a traitor trying to profit from his betrayal. Supporters called him a model of moral courage. He called himself something simpler. Clara's son, finally acting like it. Clara lived another 23 years in freedom, dying peacefully in 1882 at the age of 73. She opened a boarding house for newly arrived refugees from slavery, providing shelter and guidance to hundreds of people, making the difficult transition to freedom. In her final days, with Thomas sitting beside her bed, she said something he would remember forever. "You know what the best part of freedom is? It's not the absence of chains. It's being able to choose who you love, and knowing that love is real because it's chosen. I chose to love you, Thomas, not because I had to, but because you were worth loving. Thank you for proving me right." Thomas wept, holding the hand of the woman who had been more of a parent to him than his biological father ever was. "Thank you for choosing me, Mama Clara. Thank you for teaching me what love actually means." She died that night, surrounded by people who loved her by choice, not compulsion. Her funeral was attended by over 200 people, many of them people she had sheltered, helped, and guided in their first days of freedom. Thomas spoke at the service. People asked me why I did it, why I betrayed my father, gave up my inheritance, threw away my future to help enslaved people escape. The answer is simple. Clara raised me. She taught me that people are people, that suffering matters, that love transcends the arbitrary categories society imposes. I didn't free anyone. They freed themselves. I just provided some tools. But Clara freed me in a much deeper way. She freed me from the moral blindness I was born into. Everything good I've ever done, I learned from her. After Clara's death, Thomas continued teaching and writing, but he withdrew somewhat from public life. He had never sought recognition, and as he grew older, he wanted it even less. He died in 1890 at the age of 53, relatively young but having lived a full and meaningful life. His gravestone, placed next to Clara's at her request, read simply, Thomas Whitmore Junior, son of Clara. Finally. The story of the Whitmore liberation spread quickly through abolitionist circles in the late 1850s and early 1860s. 127 people escaping simultaneously, aided by the master's own son, was unprecedented. It became both an inspiration and a cautionary tale. For abolitionists, it demonstrated that people in positions of privilege could choose to use that privilege for justice. For slaveholders, it represented their worst nightmare, that their own children might turn against the institution that enriched them. When the Civil War began in 1861, the story took on new significance. Union recruiters used it in propaganda. Even slaveholders' sons know slavery is wrong. Join us in ending this evil institution. Several of the freed Whitmore slaves became prominent abolitionists themselves. Moses wrote a memoir detailing the escape, giving credit to the careful planning of the enslaved community while acknowledging Thomas's crucial role. Ruth became a sought-after speaker, traveling across the North to tell her story. Isaiah joined the Union Army and fought in several major battles, but the most interesting legacy was the debate about Thomas himself. Was he a hero or simply someone doing the bare minimum? Did his one good act redeem 22 years of complicity? Should he be celebrated or viewed with ambivalence? Even among those he had helped, opinions varied. Some of the freed slaves remained grateful to him for his entire life. Others acknowledged his help, but pointed out that he had lived in luxury built on their suffering for over 2 decades before acting. A few felt uncomfortable with any narrative that centered a white person in a story of black liberation. Thomas himself seemed most comfortable with the ambivalent interpretations. In interviews late in his life, he was consistently humble about his role. People call me brave for what I did, but brave would have been questioning slavery at 15, at 10, at 5 years old. Brave would have been refusing to benefit from stolen labor. What I did at 22 wasn't brave. It was the bare minimum of human decency, arrived at far too late. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who finally stopped being complicit in evil. When asked if he regretted losing his inheritance, he was emphatic. I regret that it took me 22 years to act. I regret every meal I ate, every comfortable bed I slept in, every moment of leisure I enjoyed while 127 people suffered to provide it. I don't regret what I gave up. I regret what I took for so long. The memoir he published, Two Mothers, was controversial precisely because it centered this ambivalence. He wrote honestly about his complicity, his moral blindness, his years of choosing comfort over conscience. He also wrote lovingly about Clara, about the ways she had shaped him, about the debt he could never fully repay. Critics accused him of profiting from his betrayal, of using a narrative of redemption to make himself look good. But the book sold modestly, and Thomas donated all proceeds to organizations helping refugees from slavery. He wasn't getting rich from his story. He was trying to process it publicly, to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. The freed Whitmore slaves maintained contact with each other for decades. They formed a community association, held annual reunions, and supported each other through the challenges of building lives in freedom. Some prospered, opening businesses and sending their children to school. Others struggled with poverty, discrimination, and the ongoing trauma of having lived as property. But all of them were free. All of them had the right to make choices about their own lives, to keep their families together, to work for wages and keep the money, to go where they wanted, when they wanted. The fundamental difference between enslavement and freedom, the ability to choose, was something they never took for granted. By the early 1900s, as the generation that had been enslaved began to die out, the story of the Whitmore liberation was preserved in multiple memoirs, newspaper articles, and family histories. The basic facts were undisputed. 127 people one night, aided by the master's son, all reaching freedom. But the interpretation remained contested. Some framed it as a story of white redemption, a bad system producing someone good enough to reject it. Others framed it as a story of black liberation, an enslaved community strategically using the tools available to free themselves. Still others saw it as a story about love, specifically about how love can transcend the boundaries society imposes. Perhaps all three interpretations were true simultaneously. Perhaps the story's power came from its refusal to be simple, its insistence on moral complexity, Its acknowledgement that good acts don't erase past complicity but matter anyway. In modern scholarship, the Whitmore liberation is taught as a case study in several different contexts. In discussions of the Underground Railroad, it demonstrates how the network could handle large-scale evacuations. In discussions of white allyship, it raises questions about privilege, complicity, and redemption. In discussions of enslaved people's resistance, it shows how strategic the enslaved community was in identifying and using available resources. The former Whitmore Plantation still exists, though the original buildings are long gone. It's now a historical site run by descendants of the freed slaves. The museum there tells the full story. Clara's forced nursing of Thomas, the separation when he was 8, his eventual awakening, the careful planning, the night of liberation, and the complicated aftermath. One exhibit focuses on the question that visitors ask most often. Was Thomas Whitmore Jr. a hero? The exhibit doesn't answer the question. Instead, it presents multiple perspectives. Clara's view, from her letters. He was my son. He chose right when it mattered. That's enough. Moses' view, from his memoir. He was a tool we used. A useful tool, one that chose to be useful, but still just a tool. We freed ourselves. Thomas's own view, from his memoir. I was complicit in evil for 22 years. Then I stopped being complicit for 8 hours. I don't think that makes me a hero. A modern historian's view. He represents the complicated truth that people in positions of privilege can choose to use that privilege for justice. But that choice doesn't erase their prior complicity or make them the center of the story. The exhibit ends with a question for visitors. What would you have done? And how long would it have taken you to do it? Most visitors leave without answering, which is perhaps the most honest response. It's easy to think we would have been Thomas, seeing injustice and acting immediately. It's harder to admit we might have been Thomas at 20, at 18, at 15, seeing injustice and choosing comfort over conscience. The real legacy of the Whitmore liberation isn't about whether Thomas was a hero. It's about the 127 people who walked into freedom that November night, who rebuilt their lives in Canada and the northern states, who raised children who were born free, who created a legacy that continues generations later. It's about Clara, who loved a child who wasn't hers, who suffered for decades, and who died free, surrounded by love. It's about Moses and Ruth and Isaiah and Sarah and all the others whose names are preserved in the historical record, whose courage and intelligence and strategic thinking made liberation possible. And yes, it's also about Thomas. Not because he was extraordinary, but because he finally became ordinary in the best way. He saw suffering, recognized his complicity in it, and chose differently. Not perfectly, not quickly, but eventually. The final display in the museum is a simple quote from Clara's last letter to Thomas, written a week before she died. Blood doesn't make family. Choice makes family. You chose right, baby boy. You chose love over inheritance, conscience over comfort, freedom over the easy lie of complicity. I'm so proud of you. I always knew you had it in you, the ability to be better than what you were raised to be. That's all any of us can do. Be better than our circumstances tried to make us. Maybe that's the real lesson. We're all products of unjust systems. We all benefit from privileges we didn't earn. We all participate in wrongs we didn't personally create. The question isn't whether we're complicit. We are. The question is what we do with that complicity. Do we hide from it? Deny it? Or do we, like Thomas finally did, acknowledge it and choose differently? The answer matters less for the past, which can't be changed, than for the present and future, which still can be. If this story moved you, if it made you think about family, complicity, privilege, and the complicated nature of redemption, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Was Thomas a hero? Was he just doing the bare minimum? Does it matter? What would you have done in his place? Subscribe for more stories that refuse simple answers, that honor complexity, that remember the people who chose courage over comfort, however long it took them to make that choice. The story of Thomas and Clara reminds us that love transcends biology, that family is choice, and that it's never too late to stop being complicit in evil. But it also reminds us that stopping complicity doesn't erase it. It just means you finally stopped making things worse, and sometimes that's enough. The end